Let's bring in some reaction now. We're joined by Thandolwethu Lukuko of the South African Climate Action Network. A very good evening to you, Thandolwethu. Thank you for your time. The aspect of climate change continues to pose a threat to South Africa. As we look at the benefits of the climate change report, I mean, how much can be leveraged from that as we try and bring climate change to a standstill?
Hi, thank you so much for having me on your show. I think that is how much can be leveraged, and at this point, it's safe to say South Africa is going to try and get as much as we can. For the entire transition, the last count was around 100 billion US, right? With the 8.5 billion that was committed to by the IPG, that still leaves a big 90% of the amount unfinanced. And so what we're going to try to do as a country is use both public financing and also private financing and blended financing, which is obviously a combination of the two, to try and cover that shortfall within the shortest possible time, because of course we are in a race for time when it comes to anything climate change related.
With South Africa being the world's 15th biggest producer of climate warming greenhouse gases, and also the challenge struggling to raise adequate funding to finance transition from coal, away from coal, where would you say most of South Africa's climate funding is spent at the moment?
Yeah, so I just want to apologize for the background noise. Airport. At the moment, it's all going towards, or at least largely going towards energy. This is for a couple of reasons. The biggest challenge we have as a country is, of course, in securing how much electricity we have as a primary thing, because it obviously impacts on investments that businesses are wanting to make in the country. It impacts investors who are outside who aren't wanting to come into the country, and it affects our economy largely. So how can we best shore up enough electricity to be able to power the country from night until day, or to a full 24-hour period? So that's the first thing. And then once we've secured enough energy security, which in part requires that we move away from load shedding, the next bit is then how do we make sure that we reduce our reliance on coal? As you know, at the moment, South Africa's got about 80% of its coal-fired power from coal specifically, and so we need to get it down to at least a more manageable number that's not going to leave us so exposed to climate impacts. The best way to do that is through renewables, wind and solar. And so to that effect, we've seen that South Africa has had significant investments in coal, in renewable electricity, right? So both from wind and solar. The next big investment then will be on hydrogen, which will then help us move completely away from coal as a reliance, completely away from gas as well. And it will allow particularly our manufacturing sector and large energy users to be able to continue to power their activities. So this is where the bulk of the funding is going to, is particularly that 8.5. From there, once we've kind of secured our ability to have sufficient supply, then we start to look at other sectors of the economy that require investments. So we're looking at the tourism sector, we're looking at agriculture. These are two other sectors that are heavy polluters within the country. But at the moment, it's largely focused around energy and ensuring that South Africa has got sufficient energy to meet its day-to-day needs.
There's also a warning that South Africa could be falling short of its ambitions and targets, as well as commitments to combating and preparing for climate change. Where do some of the big challenges lie as we look to this goal?
Probably the biggest one at the moment would have been this coal and how much of a reliance we have on coal. You would recall that one of the policy documents, I think it was the NDP, stated that at some point we were going to reduce our coal fairly significantly. And how we were going to do that was by closing down about 22 coal power fire stations, right? 22 gigawatts of power. Now, that was backtracked because load shedding became such a pervasive issue. And so one of the impacts that it's had is that we continue then to burn coal. We will continue to burn coal, and we will unfortunately need to also invest in gas. This is what we're being told, in order to plug this hole that we have for how much electricity that we have. It's great that the energy availability factor at Eskom has increased and has allowed for 100+ days of no load shedding to happen. But that's still insufficient to be able to meet the day-to-day needs. And for that to be met, it has to be coal, unfortunately, at the moment, because that's what we have. Yeah. But in so doing, it then increases how much emissions that we continue to put in the environment, right? And so South Africa, having been placed as number 15 in the world for its energy intensity, it's largely based on coal. And so the reliance on coal continues to exacerbate that particular number. And so we'll still be in the high tens or early tens, if you will. Now, for as long as we continue to burn coal, we're going to be missing our emissions targets, because although there's technologies called scrubbers, for instance, that you would put into a power station to ensure that the amount of dirty emissions you're putting out into the atmosphere are extracted before it comes out of the exhaust, is not yet in place in many of Eskom's facilities. And so we're still going to be producing a lot of this coal, still going to be producing a lot of these emissions. So we're very likely going to miss our targets by 2030, as envisaged in the NDP. Yeah. And that's the primary reason for why. The other reason that is also then a major challenge, which you've heard in the clip, is access to financing that would allow us to be able to make these investments, both from a state perspective, but also from a private sector perspective, right? You need to be able to put your money in a space where you know that is the investment direction that we're going to be moving into as a country. And one of the things that hasn't happened for a long time, although we have been trying to deal with it, is how do we align policy in such a way that it allows us to be able to, number one, generate the kinds of electricity that we need to be able to meet our climate commitments, but number two, also get the requisite financing from all of these different sectors to be able to finance all of this, to be able to happen at as short as possible time, including the argument of how we can get the best preferential rates, interest rates that is, for that financing, both from the domestic market, but also particularly from the international capital markets. That's been the major challenge at the moment. And so for as long as we aren't able to kind of find that sweet spot, if you will, it kind of delays the ability to really act in this fullest sense to be able to meet our climate commitments.
Now, just looking at perhaps what may have been as a result of the impact of climate change, what we saw on Monday being the world's hottest day on record, how could that have been established?
It's been a long time coming, because over the last few years, we've been hitting new highs every single year. 2022 was the previous hottest year on record prior to 2023. At the end of 2023 was then the highest year on record. So it's not entirely surprising to us who are working on some of these issues to hear that we've now reached one of the highest temperatures ever. And the scary part is we're finding it's happening sooner than the end of the year. And you'll probably also find that it's going to happen more frequently in different parts of the world. Even though one might claim that, it was announced for a European area at the time, and we were in winter, the issue is when you look at it from a global perspective, right? That temperature increase, doesn't matter where you are in the world, is significant. And so once it begins, how we term it typically is the global average. If the global average is a 2-degree temperature increase, for South Africa, it means it's going to be a 4-degree temperature increase. And so even though we are in winter, we're seeing, as we see now in Cape Town, the amount of flooding that we're seeing. We're going to be seeing increases of droughts in areas where it's dry. And so it's going to have a direct impact on people's livelihoods. But unfortunately, because of the nature of this beast that we've created as a society and as humanity, it is going to get worse before it gets better, not unless we get the kind of political support to really scale up things like investment opportunities into renewable technologies, for instance, favorable financial terms to support then the development and rollout of these tools, technologies, and what have you, to be able to minimize how much of an impact we have on the environment.
Yeah. Thank you so much for weighing in on this discussion and really giving us your expertise there. Thandolwethu Lukuko of the South African Climate Action Network.